Hi, this is Congressman Joe Morelle. I am delighted today to have a great friend and someone who's a leading thinker around science and technology. Simon Johnson. Dr. Johnson is an MIT economist, was the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, has written a number of books, one in particular we're going to talk about, Jumpstarting America, and a brand new book, which he's just authored, and I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about this. But we had the chance over the last several years to talk about regional economic investments and research and development by the federal government, how that will grow economies in places like Rochester and other mid-sized cities who typically don't get the venture capital private investment that other cities, particularly the sort of the big five metropolitan areas around the country, are getting. So I'm really delighted to have you. Thanks for stopping by. I know you spent a lot of time in Washington, go back and forth between there and MIT, so welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start a little bit by talking about regional technology hubs, but really that grew in my consciousness. I had spent time in the New York State Assembly. I had authored a report called Creating a State of Innovation, which urged the state of New York to really invest in innovation and technology to rebuild the economy, particularly in upstate regions that had been old, sort of Rust Belt industrial. And came upon the work that you and Dr. John Gruber did in Jumpstart America. So maybe we could start there and just talk about sort of the perspective that you shared in the book and why this investment by the federal government would be so important in jumpstarting the economy of the United States.
Absolutely. So a real strength of the U.S. historically was we had this massive geography. We had a lot of different places. We had upstate New York, which of course was a powerhouse of the late 19th century, early 20th century. But what's happened over the past 30 or 40 years is that innovation has become much more concentrated in just a few places. So there's the Silicon Valley phenomenon on the West Coast, Seattle, LA, a little bit, Boston, definitely, New York City to some extent, and also a little bit around DC. But it's very concentrated in a few big places. They're very expensive places to live. It's hard to attract the workers that you need. And why in this enormous country with all these smart people living so many places like Rochester, why does all the innovation have to be in the megacities? It doesn't. But what's going to tilt the balance back? It's not the private sector. Venture capital is not doing this by itself. However, we have these strong universities, we have the deep pockets of historical innovation. Again, upstate New York is a perfect example. So let's have the federal funding available for a broader set of places and use that as a catalyst for economic development.
You know, you said something really important, and people would think that venture capital, private investment, would go anywhere that there was great ideas, right? But I think venture capitalists probably, and you could certainly speak to this, look for places where they've been successful because it's just easier. You don't have to build more infrastructure, and they tend to sort of settle in these key areas, and they've found success there. So it's really not necessary, I assume, for them to go looking for places where they don't have networks and connections.
Exactly. The venture capitalists will focus on places they've already been successful, and they'll expect the entrepreneurs to come to them and set up companies near the venture capitalists. They used to say before COVID they were willing to drive 1 hour to visit their companies. It might now be an hour and a half, but it's not changed that much.
Yeah.
And as a result, if you wait for the venture capital to come to upstate New York, you're going to wait a long time. However, if you're developing the technology and if you have the deep human capital that's really been connected with risk capital, government risk capital, capital coming in through the universities, university endowments, for example, long-term patient capital, that then becomes a different proposition for the venture capitalists. I've been to Rochester and I've met a lot of people, high net worth individuals, but they're not, and historically, by the way, 100 years ago, those people would have been very involved in new enterprises. Not so much anymore, and I think there's a balance there that can be tilted back the other way.
Yeah, it's sort of funny talking about Rochester, and I don't want to talk entirely about my hometown, but you know, when people would look at it, I was talking to Secretary Raimondo about this just a week or so ago, and she said, tell me a little bit about, you know, the history of where you were. And I'd say, well, if you think about Rochester, even a century ago, George Eastman, and then eventually, and Bausch and Lomb around the same time, in Xerox, which was a little later in terms of the development of xerography. But those were, while manufacturing is what people think of in upstate New York, and certainly Rochester when it comes to manufacturing, but really the DNA was about innovation. I mean, George Eastman and photography, and that really was about imaging, and ultimately became about the development of film and how to use film, and which is now being used in ways that have nothing to do with photography. But we really benefited, and Bausch and Lomb, because of their expertise in lenses, which is also true of Kodak and Xerox. But the point is, it was really more about the innovations, and our community benefited from that. People think of it as manufacturing, but it was really more about innovation. Many other communities were probably more established, Rust Belt, basic manufacturing, industrial, and ours was different. And it really, for a long time, sort of separated us out. And then I think those advantages sort of diminished. But it's the same basic principle that you're talking about in Jumpstarting America, how we can really utilize that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think DNA of innovation is a really powerful thing, and it's also very long-lasting. So when we wrote our book, Jumpstart America, we tried to put together a pretty transparent ranking of places by their innovative potential. And we have various characteristics. We also built a website where people can play with the index themselves. They could change the weightings. But Rochester, interesting enough, came out on top. Now, that wasn't because we were predisposed to that, and you and I had never talked before that. Nope. But that was an honest cards on the table, and we thought, well, that's really interesting. And so it's about having talented people. It's about level of education. It's about having the universities, of course, both close by and in the broader area. And all of those things are massive assets. I would also point out that Boston, not so very long ago, when I was a graduate student in the 1980s and into the 1990s, there was a lot of concern that Boston had lost its innovation edge because a few companies, Digital Computer, Wang Computer, they had failed. They had not prospered. And people said, well, it's the weather in Boston, or it's the culture in Boston. All the innovation's gone to Silicon Valley. Not true, right? And Boston is a very innovative place. That same innovation DNA saw them through, and they built Biotech Hub based on a lot of federal government money, by the way, through NIH and other sources. So I think the same proposition and the same possibilities apply to places like Rochester. If you've got the innovation DNA, if you can harness it, if you can get that positive relationship between local government and business, and if there's the right kind of federal money as a stimulus, you can absolutely harness that innovation DNA once again and become another hub.
So I want to pick up on that, because this is really so important. Part of the importance in terms of recommendation of the book is how to use the federal government and investment. And I often quote, and I think this is true, and I hope so because I keep quoting it, but if you look in the mid-1950s, federal government R&D investment as a percentage of GDP is about 0.6%. In the late 60s, it rose to almost 2% of GDP. I think we're back down near mid-1950s levels. And so I think you make the argument really effectively that it is the role of the federal government to make these investments in R&D. And I think the CHIPS and Science Act do that. But why is that so important? Why is it just the money, which is obviously important, or does it also say something about the priorities of the government, and does that help really leverage then private investment? Will private investors look at where federal investment is going?
Well, the Human Genome Project is a fantastic example of what you're talking about, Joe, which is that initially, when the scientists had the idea, they took it to private venture capital, who said, "Well, that's pretty cool, but how are we going to make money off it?"
Yeah, what do we do with
Because what
it?
your proposal is to create general knowledge, and the thing about general knowledge is it has many spillover effects. It's quite hard to turn into patent or other form of intellectual property. So the federal government steps in. It spends tens of millions of dollars, creates an industry worth billions, and 300 or 400,000 well-paying jobs around the country. Right. That's what you get from a catalytic effect on science. If you go back historically and say, where did we get jet aircraft? Where did we get semiconductors? Why did we lead the world in computers and internet development? And all of the drug development, which is we're still the world leader in across the board in drug development. This is all catalyzed by federal government money that goes into the science, it goes to support the innovation, and it then encourages it to be pushed out to be commercialized. But we don't have the federal government as competing with private entrepreneurs, and we don't have it running exactly competing with venture capital. Now, there's really interesting questions, and I think Secretary Raimondo is exploring those boundaries. How much more can the federal government do before it becomes something that disturbs private enterprise? But right now, it's a catalytic effect, and it's a catalytic effect that we need to scale up, and that's what the CHIPS and Science Act aspires to do.
And I remember, although I was a young boy when this happened, but one of the advantages I thought of the United States commitment to the space race in the 60s, which was, geopolitical reasons, and, President Kennedy was concerned about the Russians having yet one more win after Sputnik, really dedicated to going to the moon, which seemed like, I'm sure at the time, for many people, including in the science and in the space community, kind of a crazy thing to commit to, but we achieved it. But it was that investment which I think people would say, why are we messing with this? But think about all the advances that came, miniaturization and material sciences and navigation systems and all the things that happened, which were initially developed using federal investment, but then to your point, really took off in terms of commercialization. I mean, there's no end to the number of things that change. But I would argue, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, that was less about space. It was more about investing in technologies, which would then people would say, well, I wasn't sure what to do with this, but now that it's available, I can think of 100 things that we could use in the commercial space with that. I mean, that's part of the magic of this, isn't it?
Absolutely. So I think actually going to the moon was a good headline, but we didn't gain that much specific from it. But creating a satellite business, satellite communications, that's a huge part of national defense and commercial, supporting directly commerce and all kinds of other commercial ventures built around that. And the space race, of course, began in its most intense phase after the Russians launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in 1957. The response of Congress was bipartisan. President Eisenhower led the charge to create the National Defense Education Act, which was, I think, the really first big push after the GI Bill. That was the first big peacetime push to expand access to higher education for people who couldn't previously afford it. There was also a lot more money put into math and physics teaching in high schools and I think middle schools as well as in universities. That was transformational. We're big fans of the space race, Joe. The problem is if you tie it to one particular mission, like we're going to go to this or that planet,
right.
Once you've gone there, people lose track. What we should have focused on is what you said, which is these are investments in the basic science and the applications that will generate more good jobs, and we have to keep it going. And that's what we've been arguing for, and that's what you've been working towards, which is recommitting to those investments because they have so many positive spillover effects.
Yeah, and I think it's true that often when you're dealing, certainly with the basic science, but then even the applied science and the technology, it's often not clear where this is going, but it's going to help accelerate the development in ways that you might not even think. It was funny, I was talking to someone yesterday talking about just the development of the internet, which initially, and I remember the first time I went online and you know that sound, and then you'd be, and a friend of mine who was very gifted in software and hardware at the time, he said, "You're online." I said, "That's great. Now, what do I do with this?" Right. And there wasn't really much to do. So at first it seemed like just sort of a curiosity. Now can you imagine doing that? Was only 20 years ago. I don't know, maybe I'd lose track of time. But now it's hard to imagine some of the most important things that you do. It's hard to imagine not having this ability to communicate mobily. I mean, in those days it was sitting at a big desktop. It's remarkable. But things that we couldn't have envisioned, and I think most people at the time would say, well, this is great, but what do we do with it? Now it's hard to imagine life without it. In fact, be without access to your mobile devices for a few hours, and it's really interesting. It reminds you how connected we've become.
That's right. So innovation has transformative effects. We can't anticipate exactly what those will be. I don't think, however, we should just sit back and let it happen. I think we should try to guide it, which is what you and the Chips and Science Act is trying to do. There's a really interesting parallel between what the US did in World War II and what we did during COVID. In World War II, we tapped all of the scientific abilities of the country to develop radar and develop other applications that had military use. Yeah. And subsequent to that, the federal government decided we should continue to invest in science because it has a national defense element, but also because it helps with employment, it helps with good jobs, it helps with health. So in the COVID pandemic, we were looking around desperately for something that would help us. And it was realized in the people who are specialized on vaccine development that we had this technology, which we'll know as mRNA, which had not previously been used to deliver this kind of vaccine. It was developed very quickly. We used the scientific talent of the country. We made a vaccine available very broadly. And it helped millions of people and saved millions of lives. That was exactly the same sort of tap. You can only tap the scientific capabilities in a crisis if you built them in peacetime, and if you've invested and if you've developed the education and you brought more people into the universities and into the private sector firms that are innovative. That's a key national strategic resource.
Yeah, that's right. I think messenger RNA was originally sort of thought of as a cancer approach to dealing with cancer and alerting the immune system. And to your point, really smart people will start to figure out, well, maybe there's a connection here, or there's a use that we hadn't originally thought of. But that is kind of the beauty of investing in science. And I do think, and particularly when it comes to federal investment, it's going to have to be targeted, because we're going to have to be really thoughtful and intentional. There's only so many dollars that we're going to be able to invest. And we have so many challenges, whether it's artificial intelligence or dealing internationally with challenges from the Chinese in terms of cybersecurity. I mean, there's a lot of things that we have to focus on, not to mention the climate crisis and other challenges that we have. So federal investment targeted. And if you were the Secretary of Commerce, how would you sort of begin to sort of think about how we not only invest the money, but what are those disciplines? How would we organize this in a way that maximizes return both to the government, but more broadly to the American public?
Well, the Secretary of Commerce has a tough job, and I don't envy her right now. Personally, Joe, I would do it all. Okay, but that's my job, is to be somewhat inspirational and encouraging. Your job was to narrow it down. And I do think the focus on semiconductor chips, the chips part of the Chips and Science Act, was pretty sensible, because we learned during COVID just how strategic these things are. We learned that a lot of the chip production is in, let's say, geographies that can be less than fully reliable for various reasons. And so having more of that production done effectively at home in the United States is attractive, particularly if we can link it to innovation. So if the manufacturing can sit with the innovation, like the history of Rochester, that's a very big win-win. I think beyond that, the Department of Commerce and the National Science Foundation and other responsible officials have got the job of deciding where are the priorities, where can we have a big bang for the buck. I mean, I've spent some time talking to people about photonics in Rochester. I'm not in charge of allocating funds, but that seems like a perfect example where next generation communications, next generation of transmission of information, that just seems like the right kind of space that any country with the opportunity should try to pursue. But beyond that, what John Gruber and I emphasized is, let's make sure we don't forget about jobs and where the jobs are created. Because if this R&D push becomes bi-coastal, West Coast, East Coast only, the middle of the country is going to be looking at that saying, well, really, what have you done for us recently? And our experience is there's a lot of people on Capitol Hill and across the country, irrespective of party affiliation, who want more good jobs and who believe in science and technology and would like to have investments in their communities that benefit their communities. And honestly, when we go to the local level and talk to people, I often don't notice or forget to ask which party people represent. Everybody wants that kind of positive agenda. They don't want to get squeezed out. They don't want excessive gentrification. They want local people to have opportunities, but they also want there to be investment, and they want dynamism, and they want to tap their innate or develop further their innovation DNA. So let's do it.
Yeah, and I do think you're completely on point. That I think whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, liberal, conservative, progressive, however you just define yourself, the people want the same things. They want great career opportunities for potential investment. They want to look at an economy that's going to benefit their children and to help educate their children and give them opportunities. The question is kind of how you get there. What role, if any, does government play appropriately? I think it's for those folks who think that the government shouldn't be involved in this anymore. I think that becomes antiquated, particularly if you look at some of our world adversaries. I mean, the Republic of China, they're investing money. The People's Republic of China is investing public money in the development of these disciplines, and so I think it's sort of naive to think that you can achieve this without some government investment.
Absolutely. Only the federal government has the perspective, the deep enough pockets, and really the interest in investing in basic science. And if you look, we do this very well in two clear pockets. One is National Institutes of Health, where this is exactly what the federal government does, and then it plugs into further development and commercialization. And the other is Department of Defense. Department of Defense, which isn't always as high profile given what they're doing, but they're very committed to improving basic science in their areas so that those can then be applied directly. However, those two spheres, health and defense, are only two of the many spheres of economic and other activity in this country and in the world. And so taking that idea, and as you said, we used to do a lot more of it in the 50s and 60s. So going back to our history, taking what works right now and saying the federal government invests in those things where there's big spillover effects, where we know there's high rates of return, and they're not going to be captured by the people making the investment directly, so that venture capital doesn't want to do it, but we will get the benefit in terms of higher incomes, higher tax revenue back to the federal government. Absolutely, that this is the bedrock of modern prosperity.
Yeah, So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was it seems to be important in regions for folks to come together in the region and identify where they're at a place technologically around a particular discipline that elevates them, that makes them, if not world class, close to world class, so that everyone isn't trying to do everything. I mean, everyone can't do quantum communications. Everyone can't do photonics, for instance. How important is that when we are going through and assessing regions that they really identify, even if it's a tough exercise to go through, where they're particularly strong?
Yeah, I think that's a key element and something we strongly encourage. I think you see the regions that have done this well exactly have a process. It might be a little tough, right? Because you can't do everything, you can't make everybody happy, but a focus on something that's very prospective, that can attract federal government science money, commercialization money, and maybe some inward investment from private sector firms that they're willing to commit to early on. I think that's really, really important. I also think the role of universities is super important.
Yeah.
Let's say I know some universities that are very proactive and very engaged with business, and some that are a bit more standoffish. We're always telling people, get engaged and figure this out. I'm an economist, but I work at one of the world's leading engineering schools. It's such a thrill to have those interactions, and for the university to say, yeah, go get them. Have more of those interactions with people who are actually running the private sector.
Yeah. So, I've talked about Jumpstart America, which really, for me, helped galvanize my thoughts around regional innovation. As I said, I had worked in New York to try to acquire, and we do have regional economic development councils, and we went through the process beginning nearly probably a decade ago, maybe even a little more than that, of pulling together our regional people, and that meant universities, entrepreneurs, the workforce development folks, to say, what are we really good at? What are the 2 or 3 domains in which we think we could be world-class? Photonics and optics being one in the Rochester region. In Syracuse, for instance, they're working on drone technology. But that really galvanized it, and that's an exercise I think that will help us when we're going through the regional technology hubs to make sure that the applications really identify, even though it's a hard process to go through and really sort of identify those strengths and weaknesses. This was really helpful. I want to just, you've written a new one, Power in Progress, and the subtitle is 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. Tell me a little bit about the book.
Well, I tell people the short version is it's the 1,000-year backstory for ChatGPT. Right? So ChatGPT,
Well,
generative AI, obviously very new
Yeah.
and coming at us really fast. But if you look back over US history, but also world history, European history, you can see we've grappled with powerful automation that displaces a lot of workers, but it may also create new opportunity and new things we can do. And I don't think you can stop technology, Joe, and I don't think you think that either, but we can definitely tilt it. And that's what we've been talking about in the jumpstarting agenda, and that's what you're trying to do for Rochester and for New York and for the country, which is let's get more good jobs out of it. I think generative AI is a particularly intense challenge because it is very, very fast, what we see. It's not exactly clear which jobs are most challenged, but we know there's a lot of potential to lose jobs here.
So I want to come back to AI specifically and chatbots and what that means potentially. But you just made an important point, because a lot of people are talking about, relative to artificial intelligence, the disruptions in the job market and the labor market. And I've always argued, and I believe this can be borne out, that yes, it's disruptive to existing technology can be disruptive to existing industries, but that often the benefit is brand new jobs that have never been envisioned, wouldn't have even occurred to anyone to have. So if you move from the buggy and the buggy whip world into automation with the internal combustion engine, people weren't making buggies anymore, but they were making cars, and then the development of fuel injectors. And every time you make an advance that makes automation easier in terms of producing goods and services, typically you end up with brand new jobs. I didn't do very well in macroeconomics, I'm embarrassed to say. But what's your thoughts about that? I mean, that has been true to some degree. I don't know that it's even, or that people can easily go from being someone who was building buggies to building automotive engines. But there is an ability to build new economies.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, this is something the US used to be very good at. So the car industry is a perfect example. In 1900, we made about 30,000 cars in the United States. 30 years later, it was 3 million cars. And a lot of that was about automation that was developed initially by Henry Ford and then adopted by his competitors. So when Henry Ford brought electricity into his factories and when he created the conveyor belt essentially system,
Right.
a lot of jobs were replaced by the machines, but he also created even more jobs upstream, downstream, throughout the whole auto industry. And if you think about the effect of autos on society, it was even more. So we got a lot of good jobs out of that wave of automation. But if we go to what happened after 1980 and we look at what's happened with computers or the advent of the internet, what we see there is automation, replacement of workers, and not the same generation of new tasks. So then the transition from, I had a good union, I'm 55 years old, I had a good union job making cars, and now I have to go work in retail or in fast food at a big loss of income and status. And
Right.
a change in my position relative to society and the family, that's a really difficult transition. So I think what we're arguing for, and I think what you've been working for a long time now, Joe, is more good jobs coming out of tapping the technology process, tilting it towards creating more good jobs, which will be in new science and technology applied commercially faster, better, creating more resilient companies. So I think that the agenda is to pull technology towards this more good jobs agenda. Of course, with generative AI, we have to worry about other things, including deep fakes, which you are also very focused on.
Right. So, and we need to be intentional about the new jobs. I think it's hard to do. I mean, commerce tends to do what it needs to do. I mean, the motivation is to produce product or service, but to make a profit at it. So I think we probably need a lot more conversation about how to be intentional. And it's also, as easy as we make it sound and as easy as I just tried to make it sound about that transition, if your skill sets aren't commensurate with the new economy, then it's great that, in terms of macro terms, that the economy may grow, but it doesn't do much for you as an individual or a head of household who's providing income for your family to make that transition. That's really a big issue that we have to grapple with.
Absolutely. Education, human capital, the right kind of specialized skills. The National Defense Education Act of 1958, in response to the launch of Sputnik, hit that straight on. And Congress absolutely saw that very clearly. And I hope you're able to do that again, because you don't want people to get left behind. If the technology advances and some people become more productive, but a lot of people lose opportunity, I don't think we're going to like the kind of society that comes out of that.
And it's hard to stop technology. I don't think you can. I'm not even sure it's advisable. I do want to talk about AI because it is important. It's on everyone's mind, even as we deal with the Regional Tech Hub and the Chips and Science Act, is really to be thoughtful in terms of public policy about how we make sure that some of the more malign activities and actors are stopped, and yet how we take the potential for AI, which has enormous potential in healthcare and diagnostics, and it's endless in terms of what it can do. How we empower that, how we create good jobs, and yet stop the worst instincts in people from being realized. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as we sort of come to an end
Well, we
here,
have a lot of thoughts, maybe 500 pages worth of thoughts. But the short version is, I think, applying exactly what you've been doing, Congressman, which is, let's make investments in strategic things that where we can see there can be direct positive benefits and also maybe spillover effects that would be good that we can't exactly measure. But let's also put safeguards in place. Let's not allow deep fakes. Let's not allow the abuse of images that people have posted and haven't given permission for them to be used to train some of these models. Let's be very deliberate about that and let's bargain with the technology companies in terms of what they're going to invent, and let's give them some carrots, sure, to pull them in a certain direction. We think there's too much of a fixation in the tech industry on machine intelligence, which means machines that can replace humans. Let's go for machine usefulness, which is your examples of healthcare, education, lots of other activities where the hard-pressed teachers and nurses would love to have algorithms and machines help them be better at their jobs and take some of the stress out. And that is not currently a priority because that's not where the private sector thinks the money is. So let's get the government involved with some of those federal science dollars.
It's really an important point. I often say to people that even when I'm thinking about my Apple Watch, which keeps track of my pulse and how many steps I walk, and these devices will get better and better. And in a time where we're really trying to bend the cost curve on healthcare, have better outcomes, have a better experience for both people who provide services and patients, that the tools that you could use and what you could develop in AI to supplement what doctors and nurses are doing and people in the healthcare profession could be extraordinary, as long as it doesn't replace doctors and nurses, and lose that benefit of human judgment in making decisions. And I think that's really, to your point, I think people and some technologists think they can replace humans altogether, which I don't think anyone thinks right now is a very good idea.
Well, some people do think
Well,
it's a good
maybe they
idea,
do,
and
yeah.
those people have a lot of power. So I think you're right to push back
Yeah.
against them, Congressman. I totally agree. It should be about complementing what humans and human experts can do, but keep the human in the loop. That's absolutely essential.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be the final word. I do want to, again, thank you. Your work as author of Jumpstart America and the new book, Power and Progress, 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity, and just appreciate very much your help, your advice, your counsel, and your friendship. Simon Johnson, Dr. Simon Johnson, a economist at MIT and a leading a thought leader on the question of how to use technology, how to use federal investment in improving the lives of all Americans. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks so much.